Now let's get to the next category of distortions that I would call misleading, which actually covers just about all of them, but I think there are some that particularly fit into this category. One is that you may remember Al Gore actually mounts a forklift in one part of the movie, where he rides to the top of the lift in order to show you how high carbon dioxide levels are likely to get by the end of this century. And what he's showing you is a graph. The top line of the graph shows CO2 levels fluctuating over the past 650,000 years. The bottom line in the graph shows you global temperatures. And Al Gore says, quote, "It's a complicated relationship." Well, folks, look, any of us who are adults know that most relationships are complicated, right? But he says it's a complicated relationship, but the most important part of it is this: when there is more CO2 in the atmosphere, the temperature increases because more heat from the sun is trapped inside. Now, what's misleading about this is he leads you to believe that changes in carbon dioxide levels going back 650,000 years were the driving force in climate change. It's what caused the world to go in and out of ice ages. And anyone with any basic science education knows that's not the case. So two curious points here that Al Gore fails to mention about his own graph, which is one, that if you look at those earlier warm periods, you'll find that the last 3 interglacial periods were actually warmer than the one we're in now, even though carbon dioxide levels were lower. The other point that he doesn't mention is that very sophisticated analysis of bubbles trapped in ice cores, which is what these graphs are based on, show that the warming or cooling preceded the change in carbon dioxide levels by anywhere from about 400 years to 1,000 years. So in other words, it was the changes in global temperature that drove the changes in carbon dioxide levels, not the other way around. Al Gore tells us at one point that his favorite glaciologist, a gentleman named Lonnie Thompson, completely proves that the so-called medieval warm period, it was a period, say, from about 900 AD to maybe 1250 AD, was tiny compared to the current warm period. And what he's trying to get us to believe is that we are in an unprecedented warming now, that this warming is outside the range of natural variability, because yes, there was a medieval warm period, but it was tiny compared to the current warm period. I'm showing you a graph here based on one of Lonnie Thompson's own ice core studies of a glacier in South America. And what it shows is that there were several decades in the medieval warm period that were warmer than any decade in recent years. So Thompson's study does not in fact prove what Al Gore claims it proves. Here I'm just showing you one of dozens of proxy records that I could bring forward that illustrate that the medieval warm period was in fact warmer than the current warm period. Here's another misleading claim that Al Gore makes. He shows us a graph very similar to this one, and he says over the last 3 decades, insurance companies have seen a 15-fold increase in the amount of money they have to pay out to victims of extreme weather. That is correct, but it's misleading if it is taken to mean that worldwide weather has changed in such a way as to increase the damages that insurance companies have to pay for. What's happened is that the population living in climate risky areas like coasts has exploded. Look, let's take Florida for example. Just since 1980, the coastal population of Florida has grown by more than 75%. That means more people and more property in harm's way, and so insurance companies are going to pay out more damage, more money for weather-related damages, even if there is no change in the weather. Or consider this: today, in just 2 counties in Florida, Dade and Broward, there are more people living than there were in all 109 counties stretching from Texas to Virginia in the year 1930. And so Gore shows us a graph that looks like this, that looks like hurricane-related damages are going up and up, and that's a signal that the world World weather is becoming wackier and crazier. But if you adjust that data to take into account changes in population, changes in wealth, changes in the consumer price index, what you find is this graph here, which shows absolutely no trend. In other words, if all those hurricanes had struck people today with current wealth, current population, current inflation rates, you would see that that trend of Al Gore's disappears. One other point that I want to bring up within this context of the misleading arguments that he makes. Al Gore often cites a study by a USC professor, Naomi Oreskes. And Naomi Oreskes studied about 928 abstracts of scientific articles. She didn't actually read the whole article, she read the abstracts. She's a busy woman, she has a right to economize on her time, I don't begrudge her that. But what she found when she looked at those abstracts is that none of them challenged the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment that most of the warming of the last 50 years is likely due to the increase in greenhouse gas levels. And you know something? I don't challenge that either. All right, but what Al Gore does is he tries to inflate this consensus about a very narrow point, that greenhouse gas levels are rising and it's causing global warming, into a much broader consensus that includes the proposition A, this is a planetary emergency, and B, this justifies immediate regulatory action to address this problem, including an absolute freeze on all emissions, including no new coal-fired power plants built in the United States, carbon taxes, cap and trade, efficiency standards, the kitchen sink. So in fact, when I was on Oprah Winfrey and I challenged Al Gore's claim that good science justifies a prediction of 20 feet of sea level rise in this century, he wrapped himself in the mantle of this Oreskes study and said, well, I'm simply saying what the scientific consensus says. And no, I'm sorry, Mr. Gore, the scientific consensus is actually quite narrow. It says there is a relationship between greenhouse gases and global warming. Nobody with half a scientific education would dispute that because it's basic physics. But it's a long way from there to say this is a planetary emergency and we've got to basically reorganize the global economy in order to save ourselves. That's outside the scientific consensus.